like to welcome all of you to this hybrid press conference by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Today, the IPCC is releasing its synthesis report, the last chapter of this assessment cycle. My name is Andrej Mahecic. I'm the head of the IPCC communications, and I will moderate this press conference.
WMO will publish its State of Climate report in a few weeks, where we will show that all of the climate parameters are moving into totally wrong direction. Temperatures, ocean warming, ocean acidification, melting of glaciers, sea level rise, flooding and drought events, and concentrations of main greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide. Our scientific advisory panel and the World Climate Research Programme have recommended establishment of a kilometer-scale climate modeling system to improve the cloud physics parameterization and future estimates of weather extremes like flooding, drought, and also to assess the risks of Antarctic melting and dramatic sea level rise up to 10 meters in the future. Finally, I would like to express my great thanks for the authors and hosts of the technical support units for your hard work during the past 6 years and to accomplish this sixth assessment report fully, and also to accomplish the 3 special reports. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary General Talas. We will now try to bring in the UNEP Executive Director, Inger Andersen.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon. Inger Andersen here from New York. What does the synthesis report tell us? Well, it tells us, and we know that climate change is here now. It tells us that climate change is a real threat to human and planetary well-being. It tells us, of course, that these human and planetary well-being are one and the same. It tells us that we are very, very close to 1.5 degrees limit, and that even this limit is not safe for people and for planet. And it tells us that climate change is throwing its hardest punches at the most vulnerable communities who bear the least responsibility, as we just saw with Cyclone Freddy in Malawi, Mozambique, and Madagascar, and as we saw with flash floods in Turkey just recently, and which killed together hundreds of people. This report tells us that our collective failure to cut greenhouse gas emissions leaves us on track to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming, and that continuing to march down this track will bring further intensification of extreme weather, of ecosystem degradation, and of damage to lives and livelihoods. So we must turn down the heat. We must help vulnerable communities to adapt to those impacts of climate change that are already here. The synthesis report, which chimes with UNEP's own research, tells us that we already have the technology and the know-how to get the job done. Renewable energy instead of fossil fuels, energy efficiency, green transport, green urban infrastructure, halting deforestation, ecosystem restoration, sustainable food systems, including reduced food loss and waste. Investing in these areas and more besides will help to stabilize our climate, reduce nature and biodiversity loss, and pollution and waste, the other 2 prongs of the triple planetary crisis. Deliver many other benefits, from cleaner air and healthier nature to decent jobs and more equity. It is, frankly, the ultimate no-brainer. Ahead of us this year lie the UN Climate Action Summit in September in New York, and the first global stocktake under the Paris Agreement at COP28 in the UAE. These will undoubtedly be important moments to set the tone for action in the second half of this critical decade. But if there's one clear takeaway from the synthesis report for nations, for businesses, for investors, and for every individual who contributes to climate change, it is this: we must move from climate procrastination to climate activation, and we must begin this today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these thoughtful words. We will now move to questions.
Hello, my name is Christiana with the German press agency, And my question is this is a report that has been approved by governments. So basically, governments are talking to themselves here with their dire warnings, which is a bit bizarre. But I guess the problem is that a warning and action are two different things. So I wonder whether you could give us, in a nutshell, what is your message to those people who are in power today? And what is your message to the people out there who are wondering what they can do now as concretely as possible? Thank you.
If the demand of energy, demand and supply patterns will continue as we have seen so far, and then we will suffer more in the future. And this report clearly emphasizes that we do have technology and know-how and tools to solve for the climate problems. And for instance, we have analyzed greatly about the consumption patterns and production patterns, and specifically, we have found that there's a great deal of room for improvement in the energy efficiencies to the tune of the demand energy consumption can be reduced by 40 to 70% in some sectors within the next 2 decades. That will contribute greatly in reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. Another instance is we found that a great deal of the potential for reduction in future greenhouse gas emissions in the urban centers by pursuing a very comprehensive, climate-friendly development patterns. Those are just few examples of the programs and investment patterns that countries can take to reduce the threats of climate change now and for the future. Now, with regard to for some detailed technical aspects of the message, I invite section facilitators to jump in.
So, one of the critical enablers of action that we talked about is the role of finance and financing for investment. And the message is not really governments addressing it at the core. At the core is the financial system needs to be able to respond to the challenges ahead. And there's plenty of financing that's available for multiple reasons and multiple activities. But our underlying assessment suggests in that context that the investments that need to take place in climate, both adaptation and mitigation, needs to rise by 3 to 6 times at least. And the way forward to do that is the intersection of a couple of things. One is governments are, in fact, central to give the clear signal that climate change is imminent and has to happen, and governments can do more with their public finances. That's one element. The equally important element is that the financial system itself, the banks, the central banks, the regulators, themselves have to start recognizing the urgency and pricing in the risks that climate action provides. And underlying all of this, finance needs to flow to places that need it most, has the greatest, least access, highest opportunities, and that's in developing countries. So we understand the system that needs to reform, needs to change, and it's possible to do it quickly, sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So this report is bringing together the state of the climate science over the last, what you know now. And it's laid out, we tell a little bit about where we are now, talk about where we might go in the future, and then what are the options available today. And so some of the key messaging out of that report is about how deep, rapid, and sustained greenhouse gas emissions are needed to reach 1.5, as well as accelerated adaptation to address the climate change we're already experiencing and might experience in the future. And the report lays out some concrete options that are available today to help address these challenges.
We will now go for some of the questions online. The question from Le Point, Guéric Pensée is asking for Dr. Lee first, and please do contribute afterwards. How would you describe the differences between the synthesis report of this cycle with the previous synthesis reports? Are adaptation and mitigation the most prominent changes?
The major difference between the last one and the current one is a more integrated integrated approach for climate science, its impact of climate change and response measures into this one standalone document. Number two, more integrated analysis about the synergies and trade-offs between adaptation and mitigation, mostly on the benefits of integrated approaches for adaptation and also mitigation. And third, it is probably the most important aspects. We brought in the human side of the climate change issues. That was a brief mention of this human side, demand side of the climate issues, very briefly in the AR5 synthesis report. But this time, we expanded, working groups expanded greatly the contributions from the social scientists, and Working Group 3 reports, as well as this synthesis report, very much emphasized the importance of recognizing the human dimensions of the climate change issues.
Thank you for that question. I think one thing that's also different between AR5 and AR6 synthesis report is the focus on solutions. So we are being much more concrete in terms of what can be actually done. I can talk a bit more around the adaptation. So in the synthesis report, but also in the underlying reports, we actually lay out a large number of adaptation options and make the point that adaptation options would be very context specific, something that can have very high adaptation, improve the resilience in one context can be also maladaptive in another context. So therefore, to make those correct and right decisions, the importance of consultation, the importance of including the local community voices, exactly those who are being most affected, being a part of that decision making. So I think we lay down the technological solutions, but we say technology alone will not take us there unless we have the right institution policies, and this is where a lot of the climate resilient development kind of discussions comes in. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think this report also makes clear that action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change is more urgent than previously assessed in AR5, and that this decade, actions in this decade are critical for securing a sustainable future for all. I'd also like to emphasize the report has a more integrated assessment than we have had before on the linkages between adaptation and mitigation actions, and that there are multiple co-benefits both in ecosystems and for human health by integrating adaptation and mitigation. For example, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which are often co-emitted with other near-surface air pollutants, can have huge benefits for improving human health. Shifts to sustainable, healthy diets can also benefit biodiversity by opening up land for ecosystem restoration. So the report points in detail, more than in AR5, to the multiple co-benefits we can achieve, not just for the climate, but also for society and biodiversity by taking more rapid climate action.
Is for the Secretary Abdullah Mokhtar. It's from Maxime Menguet from West France. The question is, what could be the main aims of the next assessment cycle? And is the IPCC reflecting on the shift in panel's rhythm of publication of reports?
Following the past practice, at the end of each cycle, we have a plenary dedicated to lesson learned as well as future of IPCC. Now what is expected for next cycle is to consider already one selected special report about climate change and cities, and also a report about short-lived climate forces. And of course, during this plenary for the future of IPCC, we will listen to the request from government what kind of next special report will be included. This is about the report, but also what is the focus for IPCC for next cycle. And as I highlighted already, the percentage of participation from developing countries will be improved, as well as the percentage of participation of gender will be also improved. Not only this, and it was already something was highlighted in this plenary, is also the inclusion of indigenous people, indigenous knowledge, as well as involvement for young scientists. In another word, the next cycle will be more open to any participation. This is our intention and plan to improve the next cycle. Thank you very much.
The next question is from Mitchell Beer. The question is, how do you see this report shifting the focus or outcome of the global stocktake at COP28?
This report is the resource for the policymakers in addressing the challenges and tasks posed for the global stocktake. Global stocktake is, as you know very well, is to address to understand mutually where we are, and where we want to be, and what is required to achieve that goal. And our report is organized in such a way that all the key findings of underlying working group 1, climate science, working group 2, impacts and adaptation, vulnerability, and the 3, the response measures, are integrated and summarized into the synthesis report. So we believe that this report is a standalone report to be a very effective guide for policymakers, and along with the 6 reports we already produced, those 3 special reports and working group reports, will provide a valuable resource for the policymakers to address the key tasks for the global stocktake.
Okay, the next question, and perhaps this is maybe for Peter Thorne and Dr. Lee. Based on the current science, this is a question from Barbara Moran. Based on the current science, when do you expect the global temperature to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels?
In the synthesis, we took the findings from both Working Group 1 and Working Group 3, and the finding is that almost irrespective of our emissions choices in the near term, we will probably reach 1.5 degrees in the first half of the next decade. The real question is whether our will to reduce emissions quickly means we reach 1.5 degrees, maybe go a little bit over, but then come back down, or whether we go blasting through 1.5 degrees, go through even 2 degrees and keep on going. So the future really is in our hands. We will, in all probability, reach around 1.5 degrees early next decade. But after that, it really is our choices. This is why the rest of this decade is key. The rest of this decade is whether we can apply the brakes and stop the warming at that level.
Thank you very much. The next question is for Dr. Lee from Zetland, Thomas Hebsgard. Covering climate science, it can often feel like the same points are being repeated again and again. That time is running out. What do you think are the most important new insights from this report, and do you ever feel like you are forced to repeat the same message over and over again?
What we need, science is clear on the issues of climate change. What we need from now is a political will on the part of policymakers, also on the part of constituents, that determine who will be the political leaders in each domain of their concern. Now, the second point is we need a public support to take the immediate action so that the climate neutral and carbon neutral world be a realistic world we will have. And the last point I want to emphasize is there must be a personal motivation to be on that trajectory toward net zero goal. So I believe these 3 things are the necessary element for the science to be transformed into a political outcome.
One of the new messages is this report, I think, effectively bursts the myth of endless adaptation. The report clearly shows that at higher temperature levels, the effectiveness of adaptation will go down rapidly. So unless mitigation also happens at the pace that's required, many of the adaptation that we are investing now will not remain as effective as they are today. So I think that's a new and an important message. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next question is for Gerhard Krinner. It is from Ingeborg Huhne Amundsen. Even if we take action now, is it realistic that global warming will slow down?
So the question was, even if we take action now, is it realistic that global warming will slow down? And the answer is yes. If we take action now, if we reduce emissions strongly, global warming will slow down. We will see the effects on the global mean temperature trends within 20 years. It's not an immediate effect to see, but it will be discernible within 20 years if we take action now.
Okay, the next question is from Alistair Doyle. It's for Peter Thorne. The question is this: I work for Thomson Reuters Foundation. The report highlights individual actions like mentions of cycling, walking, low-carbon diets, mental health, etc. What is driving this change? Is the IPCC trying to enlist everyone in action because governments are falling short?
So this synthesis report is a synthesis of the underlying findings of the underlying literature. It's ultimately true that emissions are the result of our individual actions. We are the ultimate consumers, we are the ultimate people driving or cycling or walking, etc. We need to be enabled by governments, but action is needed at all levels, from intergovernmental through governments, through communities to individuals. We are beyond the point where, as the late great Douglas Adam would say, climate change can be somebody else's problem. If we had had the foresight to act in 1990, to start to act in a meaningful way in 1990, we would have a vast vista of options available to us to still avoid, keep well below 2 degrees and strive for 1.5 degrees. The reality is we, at all levels, governments, communities, individuals, have made climate change somebody else's problem. We have to stop that. We have to act now. It is action across all scales. Do not say it is your government's problem, your community's problem. It is your problem as part of that community, as part of that country, to make the difference at this point for the resilient future we need, that is resilient to the climate change we absolutely have and avoids as much additional climate change as humanly possible.
Yeah, one of the roles of the IPCC report is to bring science and help inform decision-making at all scales. And so in the synthesis report, we assess a number of different options and what their implications would be for emissions, how much they cost, what we know about their effects on biodiversity or food security or water security. And we do this for a number of actions across different sectors and systems. So we have information about energy options in the energy systems, options in land, options in cities and settlements. And our role is to bring the science information so that we can help inform decision-making.
Thank you very much. The next question is from the Washington Post, from Sarah Kaplan. It's for Dr. Lee. Can report authors respond to the Secretary General call for developed nations to reach net zero by 2040, a decade before the rest of the world? Is this in keeping with the findings of the synthesis report and in this assessment cycle? And what would need to happen to make it a reality?
Yes, it's consistent because the IPCC's conclusion on our report's conclusion on the net zero by 2050 means this global. That means global average. Therefore, some parts of the countries or regions must have that global net zero goal much earlier than 2050. So is it consistent, his message consistent with the IPCC's synthesis report's conclusion, which is also based upon the underlying reports. Now, what can be done from those regions who can achieve the much earlier carbon neutrality goal. Well, those countries were able to pursue a much faster reduction of carbon emissions. They have the technology, finance, and I hope political will. Therefore, they are in much better shape than other parts of the world to be on the trajectory toward the carbon neutrality by 2050.
Thank you very much. The next question, and I believe it's going to be our last one because we are close to 3 p.m., is from Seth Bornstein from the Associated Press. It's directed to all panel scientists, but perhaps Aditi may want to start first. For panel scientists, the Secretary General called on developed nations to act faster. How important is it that rich nations act quicker than poorer? And can you talk about how historical emissions and equity factor are in there in the report, if they do? How much of the problem can be fixed by rich nations?
Rich nations, I believe that you mentioned there, has the technology, has the finance, and Dr. Gupta already mentioned, to achieve that climate goals, we need to increase dramatically, almost 3 to 6 times, the climate finance directed to the climate stabilization goal. The question is, why of sufficient, even if sufficient capital is available, why those capital is not allocated to solving the urgent problems of climate issues? That's the key question one really have to think clearly. There are many crises we face every day, and the current existing gap in the financial sector implies that the financial sector must have a different calculations than our scientists think about the necessary financial flows to the adaptation and mitigation. Now, the countries endowed with a rich technology and rich financial resources here has the responsibility, as well recognized by the Climate Convention and Paris Agreement, to help the other regions lacking those resources so that all of us can have a better future.
So we are, I think, on the questions that are on the issues that we've raised and that Dr. Lee talked about. The choices that we are now facing are more critical and more urgent than ever before. And it's taking place in the context where there are some progress. It's not that there's been no progress, but the scale of progress that we need to move to, as Dr. Lee suggests, needs to really, it's both feasible and it's possible, and we are more waiting for a combination of actions both by governments to make it feasible and possible, and for the financial system and financial sector, the banks, the regulators, the pension funds, the others, to start investing cross borders and deeply, not just for mitigation, but to also the public finances need to play a critical role in getting the financing needs for the enormous adaptation gains. And these are investments that at the end of the day have huge rates of return socially and economically. The single biggest, the highest return, our assessment suggests, may well be providing energy access in low-income sub-Saharan Africa. It could be one of the highest return opportunities that we have right now. And that's not even counting even greater return opportunities if one were to address the losses and damages and avoiding and averting some of these costs from missing adaptation funding.
Thank you very much. We also have one question for Chris. This is from the Portuguese paper Público. we have established human responsibility in climate change, and there are losses and damages already happening all over the world because of it. Now we have to be prepared to pay the price of these damages and practice climate justice? Question mark.
So the synthesis report and the underlying reports it draws on, such as the Working Group 2 report on climate impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, have stronger evidence than ever before of loss and damage from climate change, and that negative impacts of climate change are occurring in all regions. It also shows that low-income groups have the largest gaps in adapting to climate change, and that climate justice, social justice, and other equitable approaches can help close these gaps in adapting to climate change, as well as broaden and widen support across society for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and helping deliver the scaled up and far-reaching climate action we need in this decade in order to limit global warming close to 1.5 and avoid the worst impacts from climate change. Lastly, the report has a high confidence that the greatest gains in well-being, especially in urban areas, can come from prioritizing climate risk reduction for low-income and marginalized groups, especially people living in informal settlements.
We will be now wrapping up. Just to check, Dr. Lee, if there are any additional thoughts that you would like to share with the press conference before we close.
In this report, Working Group worth 1, 2, 3 reports and synthesis report, I want to highlight this point. In AR5, there was an attempt to compare benefits and cost, and the conclusion at that time was that the ranges of the benefits of climate action and mostly benefits of climate action were so large that a meaningful assessment or meaningful conclusion could not be drawn. And this time, the scientists involved in this aspect, mostly in the Working Group 3 and 2, found that the global benefit, global economic benefit of pursuing 2 degrees Celsius stabilization outweigh the global cost of mitigation. So that's a significant message that this report contains, which the AR5 reports did not have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And with that, we will close today's press conference.